Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. This week I want to talk about my Sociology of Guns students' range field trip reflection papers. Later this week on my Gun Curious blog, I will start to post some of the essays that my students wrote reflecting on our field trip to the gun range. These are some of the most popular posts that I put up on my blog, so I hope you'll take some time to read through these reflections because they're extremely insightful. I'll put a link to the blog posts in the show notes here, or you can just go to guncurious.com and you can find them there. Now, I have 16 students currently, 14 women and 2 men. Most of them have very little to no experience shooting guns. And so for the majority of them, this was their first experience firing a gun. And that is something that definitely comes out in the reflections. A second general takeaway from these essays is that this is truly a mass shooting generation. So these are current college juniors and seniors, which means in 2018, when the Parkland shooting happened, they were high school juniors and seniors. And if we go back to 2012 during Sandy Hook, they were in their late elementary or early middle school years. So their whole lives have really overlapped with a time in which concern about mass public shootings and particularly school shootings has loomed large, and this really affected their understandings, many of their understandings coming into this gun range experience, which leads to the third general takeaway, which is that this range field trip stirs many emotions in the students. Some of these emotions are, as you might expect, negative. Some of them are, in fact, positive, and many of them are conflicted because they have very negative understandings of firearms coming into the experience, but the experience itself is not necessarily negative. So they have to deal with that cognitive dissonance, and that also comes out in many of the field trip reflection essays. Let me just take a few minutes and read some snippets of some of the responses. Again, I will be posting many of these, in fact, in full on Gun Curious starting later this week. But here's a couple of snippets that reflect those general points that I just made and sort of whet your appetite for what you can expect when the full essays are posted. So this is one student said, before going on this trip, I mentioned it to a few of my friends and family. Most of them either didn't believe me or thought I was joking. When I told them it was true and I was really going to a shooting range, I got nearly identical responses across the board. You might be the last person I would expect to do that. This sentiment was one that even I shared. I never pictured myself to ever hold a gun, let alone step foot in a shooting range. I would consider myself a strong advocate of gun control and, in general, a person who dislikes guns. However, I am also committed to becoming a more informed sociologist and human being. To better understand the crisis of gun violence and mass shootings, I know that a holistic and multifaceted perspective on gun usage and ownership is essential, which led me to this course and subsequently to the Veterans Range of Mocksville. Now, another student also sort of reflects the fact that she's part of this mass shooting generation when she says, my opinion on guns has ebbed and flowed over my lifetime, and I have spent a decent amount of time grappling with the role that assault weapons play in our society. The first instance in which I started to think about guns and their usage was following the 2012 Colorado movie theater shooting and later that same year, Sandy Hook. I remember vividly watching the news reports following both of these tragic events and began to question my own safety when I went to places like a movie theater or my public school. Prior to these instances, I really only viewed guns as an item owned by hunters or by law enforcement officers. It was after these two major shootings that I started to be more uneasy around guns and fearful of the ways in which people were using them to harm others. When I became a high school student and began to formulate opinions related to the political and social justice sphere, I became increasingly more hesitant and concerned about gun usage in America. Following the 2018 Parkland High School shooting, I became heavily involved in leading a walkout at my school for the March for Our Lives that protested gun violence in America. My high school actually had a shooting scare when my sister was a student there, and they had to go into full lockdown that required the SWAT team to come. Thankfully, the shooter fled before opening fire, but nonetheless, it was a very scary situation for all the parties involved. Now, some of the students had some of these negative preconceptions, but also had to work out a different set of emotions they felt at the range. Like this other student who wrote, "When I first arrived at the gun range and gathered with the other students in my group to wait outside the fenced area, I was initially startled by the sound of the AR-15 being fired nearby. Hearing just how loud the gun was made me realize the true power of the weapon I was about to be interacting with. While I was a little bit nervous to handle the guns, I felt mostly excited. I seemed to be the most eager in my group to volunteer to shoot first. I wanted to approach the experience with an open mind, and I think this attitude allowed me to relax and appreciate my time at the range much more. The part of the field trip that surprised me the most was how much I truly enjoyed it. I walked away feeling a sense of exhilaration and as if I had been relieved of the day's tension and stress. I immediately contacted my family to tell them how great a time I had with the different types of guns. However, this unexpected enjoyment also confused me. I was wrestling with the idea of how I could have so much fun with these different guns when they are the same objects I know are used to kill people every single day." Another student writes similarly, "I have never been so nervous to go on a class field trip in my life. I knew I didn't have to shoot a gun, but I also felt that I wouldn't learn as much from the experience if I didn't. So when I walked up to the stand to hold the pistol, I was so terrified that I was shaking. From my knowledge and past experiences with guns, they had always made me feel uncomfortable and even sick to my stomach. I've grown up in a generation where guns have killed students my age, have been used by police to shoot minorities, and have become an idol in politics. Until our day at the range, I told myself that I would never touch a gun because of the pain, violence, anger, and destruction they have caused. To be honest, I still feel uncomfortable about my experience, but I've also gained more respect for guns and myself for stepping out of my comfort zone." And one final snippet actually has a bit more of a positive ending to it. And this student writes, "Actually, shooting guns made me feel powerful, and I think this for a couple of reasons. First, I know that it was something that my parents would not be completely comfortable with. My parents are extremely protective and regularly think about my safety. In addition, I am a bit of a klutz, and they only somewhat trust me with a kitchen knife. Growing up in a household in which my parents were overprotective made shooting guns feel like an act of rebellion almost. Second, I think the basic aspect of a gun being a weapon and getting to fully understand the power a gun can have. The kickback from the gun really emphasized this realization. Third and finally, I think there was an aspect of feminism that came into play. Shooting guns chipped away at the stereotype that women are weak. I learned that you must have a decent amount of strength to have good aim because of the kickback. You must hold the gun steady, and I got 6 shots on the paper. For my first time shooting, I was very impressed with myself." These are just a few snippets from a few of the essays that I'll be posting again on my Gun Curious blog. I think these reflections from the students are really interesting in that they take the assumptions that the students have going into the shooting experience and they mesh with the actual experience to produce some very interesting and diverse insights Much more than what you see in a typical social media post, these essays by the students really help us to understand where we are with respect to especially the gun curious, those who are interested but unsure about guns.